And John, we're going to get back in one of those additional features to the Pulitzer Center, but I actually wanted to, if, with apologies, move on to Will. Will, you wrote a very human feature about what Chernobyl is today and what the Japanese can expect or perhaps learn from out of that nuclear disaster. What was that like reporting that story? Had you been to Chernobyl before?
No, spent quite a few years in Russia and the former Soviet Union, but this was my first trip down there. And it was, of course, I was a little bit nervous about going there, but as I discovered, there are thousands of people who work at the power plant and in the surrounding, what they call the exclusion zone. So I began to think that, well, if thousands of people are there, it's probably okay. And I was led on an escorted tour. Most of my story, though, focused on the continuing burden on the people who were either working there or living there or were brought in to help, address the crisis 25 years ago. They're an aging cohort now, and they're dealing with a lot of medical problems. And, how do you really sort out what might have been caused by exposure to radiation, what's simply aging, what's simply the terrible pollution problems in Ukraine? It's a burden that the society is living with and is going to be continuing to live with on into several generations forward. It was a very, for them, the people I spoke with, it was emotional, seeing what was happening in Japan, thinking what had happened to them, and thinking about, how will Japan handle this any better than Ukraine has.
And I was struck in that story, Will, by the dignity and the stoicism, if you will, reflected by those people still living and working in the Chernobyl area.
Yes, they lived through a great deal in the last 25 years, and then the years before that as well. Not all of their troubles related to the nuclear accident, of course. They, as you say, hold on to their dignity, bear up as best they can.
And Andrew, I saw great evidence of that in the photos that you took in Japan just recently. This dignity and this stoicism.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I think we tried to focus a lot on the human element and get past the destruction. We spent a lot of time in refugee centers and talking to people where food was being handed out. We spent time in towns that weren't as destroyed, looking at the economic cost and gas lines and food lines outside shopping centers. So obviously destruction is a part of this story, but we tried to cover it in its entire scope.
But if our viewers who are viewing this online are seeing some of the photos of that incredible destruction, would you like to go back in a few years and see how these people are doing with the consequences of both the flood, the tsunami, and the radiation leaks?
Yes, absolutely. And in fact, I was already talking with the reporter about possibly going back for the 1-year anniversary and doing a review.
And you had some favorites there. Tell us the story about the 91-year-old man.
That was a great story. We were driving down along the coastal highway in the northeast corner of Japan, and we came to a flatland where the road had been completely washed out. And we stopped the car and got out and kind of wandered about. And then behind us, a man in an electric scooter came rumbling down the hill and proceeded to stand up and kind of survey the damage. And it turned out that he was 91 years old and had lived there his entire life. And we spent about 45 minutes with him walking around as he pointed out landmarks or where landmarks had been and explaining what life in his town had been like. Again, he didn't act like a victim. He was very stoic. I know that's a word that's been used a lot, but it's true. And he was very kind to us, and he spoke to us for a long time about what his life had been like and what it was going to be like.
Bruce Shapiro, I know these stories sound pretty familiar to you. I'm constantly amazed by the fact that in a disaster setting, so many people will talk to you and will explain things and will cooperate. What does the Dart Center advise journalists working in these situations? What that perhaps the general public is not aware of?
Well, I think in disasters, reporters actually mostly have a pretty good toolkit, in my experience. You certainly want a few ethical bottom lines. You want to know that the people you are interviewing are kind of giving their informed consent, that they're not so shell-shocked and dazed that they don't realize they're talking to a reporter. It's very important that reporters in disaster attend to their own physical safety and psychological safety, but physical safety in particular. Interestingly, in Australia, when they had the terrible bushfires there last year, I learned from reporters at the Australian Broadcasting Corporation that reporters are routinely issued fire safety gear, and which doesn't happen here in the U.S., for example, when you're covering a forest fire in California. And that both protects the journalist and makes the relation with firefighters much easier. So attending to physical safety is very important. But I think the other thing I'd address, which came up in some of the comments in the last few minutes, is this idea of going back, the idea of understanding that the story of a disaster doesn't end when the fire is out or when the debris is removed or when the bodies are buried. That what we cover when we're covering breaking news of disaster or the sort of rolling disaster in Japan now is in a sense the act one of tragedy. But in fact, these stories continue to resonate for the victims, the survivors, societies for years. And we have a big responsibility as journalists to cover the Act Two, to put Act Two on page one. I think that is a important responsibility of news organization, because it's only in understanding the recovery phase and in understanding the long-term impact of disasters that we're able to come away with important lessons and also understand just what it is that people go through.
And John Sawyer, this is
as important as Act One.
Exactly. And John, this is what part of what you were saying earlier is that this is what we have as part of our responsibility in crisis reporting.
Yes, and this goes back to the idea of a crisis and crisis reporting, and what Bruce is saying is absolutely correct, that the Act 2 and the Act 3 are just as important, but in an era when we've got serious constraints on resources for journalism, particularly journalism for coverage of big international issues, it seems to me that the news organizations have not caught up exactly with the reality of that, and you're seeing it now, and that there's when there is a big breaking story, whether it's North Africa or Japan, the earthquake last year, the Deepwater Horizon spill, everything, people throw their resources at that, and there is a huge amount of redundancy in the first coverage where the cable networks, the large news organizations are all over that story for a few days, and they spend a lot of money to have that story, and it seems that that's the only story in the world, and a lot else goes unreported because there's simply not the resources. And an example right now is Nigeria is headed towards elections that may or may not spark another round of sectarian violence, and I think that there is very little attention being paid to that by a lot of news organizations. We've just sent a couple of a reporter and a videographer there, hoping to fill that gap. But it's because there's so much attention to North Africa. Or look at Ivory Coast, that is getting a disproportionately small amount of coverage given what's happening there, because the news organizations simply don't have the manpower, woman power to send out there. And we need to address that.
And of course, the men and women who are out there are also human beings, and they're also people who are not scavengers. They're professionals who are trying to do their job. This is not that editors are bad people; they have budgets too. But this is a fascinating aspect. I just wanted to ask Andrew Burton one final quick question because we're running out of time. Andrew, why do you do this kind of work? You're a freelancer, although this time you were shooting for USA Today. Why do you cover disasters?
All I can say is that I've known for a long time that this is what I want to do. I studied international relations, politics, and economics in college, and it's long been the area of, and this has long been the industry that I've wanted to work in. I don't think disasters are particularly enjoyable to cover. I find it much more intriguing to cover something like the Egyptian Revolution, where you can explore how governments and social movements interact. It can be much more taxing to cover disaster like the tsunami, but I'm not sure where inside me it comes from that I want to do this type of work, but I know that I'm very committed to it, and I find immense meaning in it.
Good. I'm going to take that as an answer and refer people to your blog for more of your thoughts. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. It's rare to find a journalist who admit enjoying covering these kinds of stories of massive human tragedy, but someone has to do it. Thanks to our guests, Andrew Burton, Will England, John Sawyer, and Bruce Shapiro. Our director is Travis McMillan. Audio by Pat Akers. Rebecca Wolfson is executive producer. Our video producer is Tim Wall. Our other producers of Global Journalists are Courtney Flatt, David Cawthon, Ryan Kress, and Jessica Popovic. Stephanie Tabor is the production assistant. This is Byron Scott for Global Journalists, reminding you that you can download, view, or listen to this show by podcast, and also look at additional features by going to globaljournalists.org. Thank you all again for giving us this insight to this very human side of covering these very difficult stories. Tune in, and you can listen to this show again whenever you like at globaljournalists.org. Thank you all very much.